The morning sun filtered gently through the windows of the quaint suburban home, casting soft golden rays across the living room. The familiar sound of birds chirping outside blended with the quiet hum of the family's daily routine. In the center of this peaceful scene, we find Eleanor, a mother in her early 30s, sitting in a comfy armchair with a cup of tea cradled in her hands. Her movements are deliberate but slow, a result of the disability that has confined her to a wheelchair. Despite her physical limitations, Eleanor radiates warmth. She smiles tenderly at her two children, Lily, her 9-year-old daughter, and Charlie, her 7-year-old son, who are both sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by toys and books. "Mom, can you help me with this puzzle?" Lily asked, her voice bright and hopeful as she looked up from the floor. "Of course, sweetie," Eleanor replied, her voice soft but filled with the love and patience only a mother can convey. She gently placed her tea down on the side table before reaching over to help Lily with the puzzle. Her hands, though slower than they used to be, worked with grace as she carefully guided her daughter's small fingers to the right pieces. Charlie, always the more energetic of the two, tugged on Eleanor's sleeve. "Mom, I made something for you," he beamed, holding up a crumpled piece of paper with a crude drawing of their family. The colors were bright, with a sun in the corner of the paper and a heart in the center, symbolizing the love he felt for his family. Eleanor's eyes softened as she admired her son's creation. "Thank you, Charlie," she said, kissing the top of his head. "This is beautiful." From the kitchen, David, the children's father, could be heard humming a familiar tune as he prepared breakfast. The aroma of sizzling bacon and eggs began to fill the air. He called out to the family, his voice warm and cheerful. "Who wants pancakes?" "I do," the children chorused in unison, their faces lighting up with excitement. Eleanor chuckled softly, feeling a sense of contentment wash over her. Despite the challenges she faced every day, moments like these made it all worthwhile. Her family, her source of strength and love, filled the house with laughter and joy. This was the life she cherished, the calm, the simple pleasures, the everyday moments of connection. However, in the midst of this tranquility, there was an undercurrent of unease. Rachel, the neighbor across the street, had always seemed nice, friendly even. She often waved at the family and would occasionally stop by for a quick chat. But there was something about her presence that always felt off. Rachel was the kind of person who seemed to have an opinion on everything, and though she wore a smile that could light up a room, it never quite reached her eyes. Eleanor had met Rachel a few times in passing. Their first encounter had been an innocent exchange at the mailbox, a brief conversation about the weather, and a friendly offer to help with anything around the house. It seemed harmless enough, but Rachel's subtle insistence that Eleanor's house could really use some freshening up had lingered in her mind. Her tone had been too sweet, too rehearsed. Just yesterday, Rachel had stopped by again, uninvited. Eleanor had been in the middle of a quiet moment, enjoying her book, when she heard a knock at the door. "Hey, Eleanor." Rachel's voice rang through the door before Eleanor had even had a chance to answer. "I was just walking by and thought I'd check in. How are you holding up?" "I know having young kids and dealing with, her words trailed off, her eyes flicking to the wheelchair sitting by the door as if it were a silent accusation. Eleanor's smile tightened as she opened the door. "I'm doing well, Rachel. Just trying to keep up with the kids and everything." Rachel's gaze lingered on the wheelchair, her expression a mixture of curiosity and something darker, something Eleanor couldn't quite place. "Well, it's just so difficult for you, isn't it? The mobility issues, must be hard to get around sometimes." Eleanor's hand instinctively tightened around the doorknob. "I manage just fine, thank you." Rachel didn't seem to take the hint. She smiled even more brightly, though there was a sharp edge to it now. "Well, if you ever need help with anything at all, I'm always here to lend a hand. You just let me know, okay?" Eleanor had nodded politely, but something about the way Rachel's smile lingered made her uncomfortable. There was an undercurrent of control in Rachel's words, as though she believed Eleanor needed saving, something that Eleanor didn't need and certainly didn't want. Now, As the family shared a peaceful breakfast in the kitchen, Rachel's figure appeared in the window, standing at the edge of the front yard. She was staring directly at the family, her posture rigid. The smile that she often wore on her face seemed absent, replaced by an unreadable expression. David, unaware of the lingering tension, smiled and handed the pancakes to Lily and Charlie. "Here we go, guys. Breakfast is served." But Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that today would be different. The unease that had settled in her chest grew stronger as Rachel continued to stand outside, watching the family like an observer. The moment of peace felt fragile, like the calm before a storm. Eleanor didn't know it yet, but her intuition was right. Rachel's presence in their lives was about to shift from strange to dangerous. The days after Rachel's unsettling visit began to blur into each other. Eleanor tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but her thoughts frequently drifted back to that brief conversation. The polite smile Rachel had worn was no longer just a harmless expression. It felt like a mask hiding something darker beneath. Eleanor couldn't shake the sensation that Rachel's kindness came with a price. Every time she crossed paths with Rachel in the neighborhood, the woman would greet her with a little too much enthusiasm, as if trying to overcompensate for something Eleanor couldn't quite pinpoint. But Eleanor wasn't the only one noticing the oddities. David, her husband, had begun to feel an increasing sense of discomfort whenever Rachel was near. He'd tried to dismiss it at first, rationalizing her behavior as nothing more than an overzealous neighbor who simply wanted to help. After all, people were just trying to be friendly, right? But over time, Rachel's persistent comments began to grate on him. One afternoon, as David was picking up the mail, he saw Rachel standing near the mailbox again, staring at the house with a strange intensity. Her eyes, though seemingly warm, held an unsettling coldness to them. She turned to greet him, but there was something forced about the way she smiled. "Oh, David, I was just thinking about Eleanor," Rachel said, her voice overly sweet. "You know, with her condition, I'm sure it must be so hard for her to get around. It must be so difficult for you, too, trying to manage everything, especially with the kids." David froze for a moment, feeling a twinge of unease. There was something about the way Rachel phrased her comment that made it feel more like an accusation than a sympathy. He tried to brush it off with a polite nod. "It's not easy, but we're managing just fine," he said, his voice a little too forced. Rachel tilted her head, her smile never faltering. "Oh, I can imagine. It's such a shame, isn't it? I mean, it's not just the physical limitations that must be hard to cope with. I'm sure there's a lot of emotional strain, too. Must be hard for Eleanor, having to depend on you and the kids all the time." David's jaw tightened, his discomfort rising. He couldn't understand why Rachel kept pushing these personal boundaries. He wanted to respond, to tell her that her comments were intrusive, but something held him back. Was it her friendly tone? Or perhaps the nagging feeling that Rachel was subtly trying to create division in his family? "I should probably go inside," David muttered, taking a step toward the door. "Eleanor's waiting." As David walked back inside, he couldn't shake the weight of Rachel's words. Was she trying to make him doubt his wife's capabilities? Or perhaps trying to plant the idea that Eleanor's disability was more of a burden than a challenge they could overcome? Either way, Rachel's behavior was starting to feel less like concern and more like an intrusion. That evening, the tension in the air felt palpable. Eleanor had just finished helping the kids with their homework when Rachel knocked on the door once again. The polite, practiced smile on her face seemed almost too perfect. Eleanor opened the door cautiously, her intuition telling her that something was off. "Oh, Eleanor." Rachel greeted her with a sharp, rehearsed smile. "I was just passing by and thought I'd check in. How are you doing today?" Eleanor forced a smile. "I'm doing all right, Rachel. Just taking care of the kids and getting things done around here." Rachel's eyes briefly flicked to Eleanor's wheelchair, and for a split second, the smile faded before she quickly recovered. "Well, I'm sure it's tough. You must be really limited in what you can do around the house. It's not easy being so dependent on others, is it?" Eleanor's heart sank. She had been expecting this. Rachel's remarks had always been subtly condescending, but now they were crossing a line. Eleanor tried to remain calm, but there was no denying the growing sense of unease that clung to the air between them. "Look, I'm fine," Eleanor said, her voice tight. "We manage." But Rachel wasn't done. She stepped closer, her gaze lingering on Eleanor in a way that made her skin crawl. "I'm sure you do, but maybe you should consider asking for more help. There's no shame in needing it, especially with your condition." Before Eleanor could respond, Rachel's phone rang loudly, breaking the tension. Rachel quickly glanced at the screen, her expression momentarily changing from one of feigned concern to something far colder. "I'm sorry, I have to take this," she said curtly, stepping back and walking off toward her car without waiting for Eleanor to reply. Eleanor stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding. Why had Rachel looked at her like that? Why had her tone shifted so abruptly? There was something in the way Rachel spoke, something that felt too calculated. Eleanor's suspicions had only grown stronger, but she couldn't figure out what Rachel's true motive was. The thought gnawed at her. As the days went on, the tension only escalated. Rachel's visits became more frequent, and her comments became more pointed. At first, she seemed to focus on Eleanor's disability, trying to make it sound like she was just concerned for her well-being. But then, the remarks shifted. "I noticed your mailbox is a bit hard to reach from the street," Rachel casually remarked one day. "Have you ever thought of moving it closer to the sidewalk? It might make things easier for you." At first, Eleanor had dismissed it as a harmless suggestion. But Rachel's repeated comments about the house, its accessibility, its upkeep, started to feel like an evaluation, as though she was scrutinizing every detail. Each interaction left Eleanor with a deeper sense of discomfort, but she couldn't put her finger on exactly why Rachel's presence felt like a constant intrusion. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, the phone rang. It was an unknown number, but David answered anyway. His face changed as he listened, and Eleanor felt a pang of unease. "I see," David said, his voice tight. "I'll talk to her." He hung up the phone and turned to Eleanor, his brow furrowed in concern. "That was the HOA. Rachel called again. She's got some concerns about the property. Specifically, she says there's something suspicious going on. She mentioned some questionable behavior on your part." Eleanor's stomach dropped. Suspicious? What was Rachel accusing her of now? It didn't make sense. She hadn't done anything wrong. But Rachel was spinning a story, a narrative in which Eleanor's disability, her struggles, and her very existence could be twisted into something dark and malicious. David's face was grim. "She said she's going to call the authorities if the situation isn't addressed. This has gone too far." Eleanor's heart raced. She had known Rachel wasn't just a concerned neighbor, but now the threat was real. This wasn't just about comments or insinuations anymore. It was about taking things to a dangerous level. Rachel was weaponizing her supposed concern, and Eleanor was the target. Rachel's manipulation had gone too far. Now, the family found themselves trapped in a web of accusations, confusion, and fear. And no matter how hard they tried to make sense of it, they couldn't escape the growing sense of dread that Rachel had set in motion. The rise of tension was palpable, and it was clear that things were about to get much worse. The day had started like any other. The sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the house, and the children were playing in the living room, their laughter echoing through the halls. Eleanor sat by the window, her hands gently resting on her lap, watching her kids from a distance. She loved moments like these, moments when life felt normal, when the quiet hum of everyday existence drowned out the darker thoughts that occasionally crept into her mind. But today, the world outside her bubble of peace was about to shatter. It was just past noon when the doorbell rang. Eleanor looked over at the kids, her gaze soft but alert. She'd heard Rachel's name tossed around by the neighbors, and with the recent tension, she'd grown wary of any unexpected visitors. The doorbell rang again, more insistent this time. She hesitated for a moment, then motioned for Lily and Charlie to stay inside the living room. "I'll get it," she said, forcing a calm smile, Though the uneasy feeling in her stomach was growing stronger, she rolled her wheelchair to the door, her heart pounding in her chest as if some unseen force was warning her of the impending danger. When she opened the door, her breath caught. There stood Rachel, but this time, the friendly demeanor was gone. Instead, there was something colder about her, an icy mask of calculated intent. "Oh, Eleanor," Rachel said, her voice eerily soft. "I was just in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by. I noticed a few things around the house that might need attention. Is it okay if I come in for a moment?" Eleanor swallowed hard, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. The request felt too abrupt, too intrusive. She instinctively glanced back at the children, who were playing quietly in the living room. "Is everything all right?" Eleanor asked, keeping her voice steady, but there was an undercurrent of apprehension that Rachel immediately picked up on. "Oh, it's nothing serious," Rachel replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I just thought I'd offer my help. You know, with everything going on, I'm sure you've got a lot on your plate." Something about her words struck Eleanor as more than just casual concern. They were condescending, as though Rachel was looking for a reason to criticize, to find fault. She felt a chill race down her spine. "I'm fine, thank you," Eleanor said, forcing herself to remain polite. "We got things under control." But Rachel didn't budge. She stepped forward, her eyes scanning the inside of the house, as if inspecting every detail. She looked past Eleanor, her gaze settling on the children who had stopped playing and were now watching the scene unfold. "I'm sure," Rachel said, her tone almost sweet but with an edge. "But you know, sometimes a little help can go a long way, especially when her eyes flicked to Eleanor's wheelchair and she hesitated just long enough for the discomfort to creep into the air. When you're facing certain challenges." Eleanor's heart raced, and she felt the words hanging in the air like a trap. "I'm all right," she said again, more firmly this time, but her mind was already spinning. Rachel's presence was suffocating, her polite smile masking something far more sinister. Before Eleanor could respond, Rachel pushed past her with an unsettling calmness. The door swung open wider, and Rachel entered without waiting for an invitation. "Just a quick check, okay?" she said, her voice now almost too saccharine to bear. Eleanor felt a knot of panic tighten in her chest. She tried to push herself backward to stop Rachel from getting too close, but it was too late. In one swift movement, Rachel reached out, grabbing Eleanor's arm with unexpected strength. "Stop!" Eleanor shouted, trying to pull away. But Rachel's grip was firm, like iron, her eyes flashing with something darker now. Before Eleanor could react, Rachel did the unthinkable. In one motion, Rachel shoved Eleanor's wheelchair backwards. Eleanor gasped in shock, her body jerking with the force of the movement. Her hands flew out to catch herself, but there was no stopping what came next. The wheelchair tipped backward, sending her crashing to the floor with a loud thud. The sound echoed in the room like a gunshot. The children screamed in terror. "Mom!" Lily cried, running toward her mother, her face pale with shock. Charlie was frozen in place, his mouth open in horror as he watched his mother struggling to sit up. "Rachel, what the hell is wrong with you?" Eleanor spat, her voice trembling with a mixture of pain and disbelief. Her back ached from the fall, and she struggled to push herself upright, her hands shaking as she tried to regain her balance. But Rachel didn't move. She stood there, her expression blank, her eyes cold. She looked suspicious. Rachel muttered, her voice distant and emotionless, as though the explanation should have been enough to justify her actions. "I saw the way she was looking at me." Eleanor's blood ran cold. The words didn't make sense. How could she have been suspicious? She had never done anything wrong. But Rachel's words were chilling in their simplicity, as if everything Eleanor had done, everything she had worked for, didn't matter. She was simply a target in Rachel's twisted game. David appeared in the doorway, his eyes wide with panic as he took in the scene. His breath hitched as he rushed forward, kneeling beside Eleanor, his hands shaking as he helped her sit up. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice a mix of concern and fury. "I'm fine. Eleanor replied through gritted teeth, though the pain in her back and the growing fear in her chest told a different story. She turned her gaze to Rachel, her eyes blazing with defiance. Rachel simply stood there, watching, as if she were observing something far more insignificant than a woman in pain. Her lips curled into a twisted, almost smug smile. "You need to watch who you trust, Eleanor," Rachel said, her voice low and dangerous. "Not everyone is as they seem." Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest as she looked at Rachel, trying to process the words. It was as if the woman had completely lost touch with reality. How could someone be so callous, so deliberate in their cruelty? Lily and Charlie were still frozen, unable to comprehend what had just unfolded before them. Their young minds struggled to process the violence that had been brought into their safe space. Lily's sobs echoed in the room as she tried to hug her mother, her small hands trembling against Eleanor's arm. I don't understand," Charlie whispered, his voice small and shaky. "Why would she do that?" Eleanor didn't have an answer. She couldn't even begin to make sense of what had just happened. Her world had been turned upside down in a matter of moments, and the pieces seemed impossible to put back together. David clenched his fists at his sides, fighting to keep his composure. "Get out," he growled, his voice low but filled with venom. "Get out of my house. Now." Rachel seemed unfazed by his anger. She didn't even flinch. "You'll regret this," she said softly, her eyes never leaving Eleanor. "All of you will." With that, she turned and walked out the door, her steps eerily calm as she disappeared into the yard. The silence that followed was deafening. The children were crying, David was holding Eleanor, and the weight of the moment settled heavily in the room. The terror of what had just happened was sinking in, and Eleanor could barely comprehend it. Her body ached, but her mind was numb. The family was shattered. The world they had so carefully built was crumbling around them, and they didn't know if they could ever repair the damage Rachel had caused. But one thing was certain, the attack was only the beginning. The chaos, the fear, the anger, they were just getting started. The air was thick with tension as David and Eleanor sat in the living room, trying to process what had just happened. The children, though still shaken, had been tucked into bed by David, but the house felt eerily empty without the hum of everyday life. Eleanor's body ached from the fall, but it was the gnawing sense of fear, the helplessness that gripped her heart, which was the hardest to bear. As Eleanor rested her head against the back of her chair, David paced back and forth, his hands running through his hair in frustration. The police had left, promising to look into the situation, but the entire interaction had left a bitter taste in David's mouth. Rachel's ability to twist the truth, to manipulate even those meant to uphold justice, was disturbing. She hadn't even flinched when she'd spoken to the officers, her cold demeanor and practiced words seemingly having more weight than the pain Eleanor had just endured. David exhaled sharply, his eyes flicking toward his wife. "I don't understand. How could they just let her go? She physically assaulted you, Eleanor." They just brushed it off. Eleanor closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling at her limbs, but her mind was racing. "She's good, David. She knows how to play the game. She manipulated them. The police aren't going to do anything unless we can prove something more." David looked at her, his jaw tightening with frustration. "What do we do now? We can't just let this slide. I need to know what's going on with her. Who is she really? And why would she do this to us?" Eleanor opened her eyes, a chill running down her spine as the truth began to sink in. "I don't know, but I'm not going to let her get away with this. I don't care who she is or how powerful she thinks she is. This isn't over." The next few days were a blur of emotions, phone calls, and desperate attempts to find justice. David reached out to a lawyer who, after hearing their story, was hesitant but agreed to help. Meanwhile, Eleanor began to research Rachel's background, trying to piece together any shred of information that could shed light on why she had attacked her and why the police were so unwilling to take action. David worked tirelessly, contacting neighbors and friends who might have seen something, anyone who could corroborate their story. But Rachel had a reputation, one that made people hesitate to speak out. They didn't have the courage to go against someone as seemingly powerful as her. The HOA, Karen had a way of getting under people's skin, of making them doubt themselves. One evening, as David returned from another round of questioning neighbors, he looked defeated. No one's talking Eleanor. They're scared of her. They either don't know anything or they're too terrified to say a word. It's like she's got a hold on everyone in this neighborhood. Eleanor's heart sank as she listened to her husband's words. The family had been isolated, their pain and fear locked behind closed doors. But the more she thought about Rachel, the more Eleanor realized that something wasn't adding up. Why had Rachel targeted her? Why did she go so far as to assault her in front of her children? And why did the police, the very people who should protect her, let Rachel walk away without question? As the family continued to dig deeper, David's suspicions about Rachel only grew stronger. There were whispers among a few of the other neighbors about her behavior, about her history of causing trouble in the community, but nothing concrete, nothing they could use to defend themselves against her. It was becoming clear Rachel wasn't just a quirky neighbor. She was a woman with a hidden agenda, and her involvement with the HOA wasn't as innocent as it appeared. One day, Eleanor received a call from Lori, an old friend from the neighborhood who had been too afraid to speak up before. She had witnessed the aftermath of the incident, and now, after some persuasion, she was ready to talk. "I'm scared, Eleanor." Lori's voice trembled through the phone. "I don't know if I should be telling you this. Rachel, she's dangerous. I've seen her do things before, things that made my blood run cold." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "What do you mean? What's she done?" Lori hesitated. "You remember the old couple on the corner, the one who used to live there before the Johnsons moved in? Rachel drove them out, Eleanor. She made their lives a living hell, and they moved away in the middle of night. I don't know what she did, but I think she was involved in something shady. I'm not the only one who's noticed things. People talk in whispers. It's just no one's ever been brave enough to say anything." The realization hit Eleanor like a brick. This wasn't just about her. Rachel had a pattern of destruction, of pushing people to the brink, and now she had turned her attention to Eleanor. But why? "I have to know more, Lori. I need to know what she's capable of," Eleanor said, her voice shaking with determination. "I'll keep my ears open," Lori promised, "but be careful. You're playing with fire." Eleanor's mind was spinning. Rachel had gone too far this time, but it seemed like she had been doing this for years. The more they uncovered, the more dangerous Rachel became. The following weeks were spent gathering information, piecing together the fragments of Rachel's past. Eleanor and David went to the local library, pulling up old HOA records and public documents, looking for any trace of Rachel's involvement in questionable activities. What they found was both shocking and horrifying. Rachel had a long history of manipulating people to get what she wanted. In previous neighborhoods, she'd used her position with the HOA to bully residents into paying her exorbitant fees for services that never materialized. There were reports of her threatening to fine families for minor infractions, pressuring them into compliance, and even a few incidents where she had been accused of vandalism when people refused to comply with her demands. But despite the numerous complaints filed against her, Rachel had always managed to slip through the cracks, her charm and ability to play the system keeping her one step ahead of the law. One document in particular stood out: a complaint filed by a local family who had been forced to sell their home after Rachel had threatened to report them to the authorities for code violations that didn't exist. The family had been under financial strain, and Rachel had used that against them, pushing them into a corner until they were forced to leave. David slammed the file shut, his face pale. "She's been doing this for years. This isn't just about me and Eleanor. This is about her abusing her power, manipulating everyone around her, and no one's ever done anything about it." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. She had thought Rachel was simply a neighbor with a vendetta against her family, but the truth was far worse. Rachel was a predator preying on the weak, using her position to control others. She had been doing it for years, and now it was her family's turn to face the consequences of her twisted sense of control. Despite all the evidence, the police were still reluctant to take action. They argued that there was no direct proof of Rachel's involvement in the incident. It was Eleanor's word against Rachel's, and with no physical evidence, there was little they could do. It felt as though the system was working against them, and every attempt to gain justice seemed to fall apart. But Eleanor wasn't ready to give up. She had to take matters into her own hands. With the help of their lawyer, the family began to gather additional evidence, photographs of their interactions with Rachel, testimonies from a few brave neighbors who were willing to speak up, and the damning records of Rachel's past behavior. They were building a case, piece by piece, and though it felt like a slow and grueling process, Eleanor was determined to bring Rachel to justice. The stakes had never been higher, and as the suspense deepened, one thing was clear. Rachel wasn't just a dangerous neighbor. She was a ticking time bomb, and it was only a matter of time before her destructive path led to even more pain. The tension between the family and Rachel continued to mount, the cracks in her facade slowly starting to show. Eleanor and David's resolve had never been stronger. They weren't going to let this woman get away with what she had done. Not this time. The investigation had only just begun, and they were prepared to go to any lengths to expose Rachel for who she truly was. The days following their discoveries had only strengthened the family's resolve. They had uncovered enough evidence to expose Rachel's manipulative behavior and the dark web of deceit she had woven within the HOA. But just as they were beginning to build a case, Rachel's behavior became more erratic, more dangerous. The threats and intimidation tactics she had been using against them grew bolder, more direct, and the family found themselves trapped in a game where the stakes were higher than ever before. Karen's desperate measures, it began with subtle comments, small, chilling gestures that made Eleanor's blood run cold. At first, it was just offhand remarks when they crossed paths with Rachel in the neighborhood. She would smile at them, but her eyes held a coldness that had nothing to do with politeness. "You should really watch your kids more carefully," Rachel had said once, her voice just a little too sweet as she casually passed by Eleanor's house. "You never know what might happen when they're left unsupervised. It's a dangerous world out there, isn't it?" Eleanor had frozen at those words, her stomach turning. It felt like a thinly veiled threat, a warning that if they didn't back off, she would come after the children in ways that would haunt them forever. The family tried to ignore these comments, chalking them up to Rachel's increasingly odd behavior. But then came the first real sign of the depths to which Rachel would sink. One evening, David and Eleanor were sitting in the living room, catching up on paperwork, when there was a knock at the door. They exchanged uneasy glances. Rachel had stopped by more frequently in the past few days, but they had started avoiding her, not answering the door when she came calling. This time, though, there was no escaping the confrontation. David opened the door, and there stood Rachel, her smile tight and forced. The moment he saw her, David's gut instinct told him something was wrong. The once warm, almost cordial woman who had been a neighbor was now a harbinger of menace. "David," Rachel greeted him, her tone clipped. "I need to speak with Eleanor." David stood in the doorway, blocking her path. "Rachel, we've asked you to stay away. We don't want to talk to you anymore." Rachel's eyes flicked toward Eleanor, who was standing behind David, her body tense. "Oh, come on. I'm just here to offer some advice," she said with an edge to her voice, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. "You really should be more careful with what you're doing. People in this neighborhood are watching you. They don't appreciate troublemakers." David's jaw clenched. "What do you want, Rachel?" Rachel leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "If you keep digging into things you don't understand, things could get ugly. And you wouldn't want your children to be caught in the middle, would you?" Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. Rachel's words hit like a physical blow, a threat wrapped in a smile. She stood still for a moment, gathering her strength, then spoke. "Get off our property, Rachel. Now." Rachel didn't move. Instead, she leaned in even closer, her voice barely audible. "I'll make sure you regret this. I won't stop until I've destroyed everything you hold dear." Rachel finally turned and walked away, but her words hung in the air like poison. Eleanor could feel the walls closing in on her. The weight of Rachel's threats was suffocating, and she knew it was only a matter of time before the situation escalated. More threats surfaced as the days went on. The threats became more direct, more disturbing. The family had already started to take extra precautions, locking doors, setting up cameras around the property, but nothing could prepare them for the chilling turn Rachel's intimidation tactics would take. It wasn't just about words anymore. Rachel was getting closer, more involved, and her behavior was becoming dangerously erratic. One morning, as Eleanor helped the kids get ready for school, she noticed something strange. Their front yard was littered with broken pieces of what looked like an old ceramic figure. At first, she thought it was just some random act of vandalism, but as she inspected the damage, she saw something else: a single blood-red letter on the ground. The letter had been carefully placed beneath a cracked piece of the figurine. Eleanor's hands trembled as she picked it up. The letter read, "You don't know who you're messing with. I'll make sure your kids pay for your mistakes." The message sent a cold shiver down Eleanor's spine. There was no mistaking it. This was personal. Rachel had crossed a line, and now she was making it clear that her targets weren't just the adults in the family. Eleanor immediately called David, her voice shaking as she described what she had found. When David arrived home, his face paled upon seeing the letter. The broken figurine, the symbol of innocence shattered, was a warning. This was no longer just a matter of two neighbors at odds. Rachel had threatened their children, and Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get much worse. The next few days were filled with an overwhelming sense of paranoia. The family locked down every door and window, even setting up more cameras around the house. But it was clear Rachel wasn't going to stop. She had shown her true nature, and now her desperation was pushing her to take more extreme measures. The family's plan, David knew, they couldn't just sit back and wait for Rachel to make her next move. The fear of what she might do to the children consumed him. He could see the terror in Eleanor's eyes every time they passed Rachel's house. His wife was afraid for their family, and rightfully so, but there was a growing determination within him as well. This wouldn't end with them being intimidated into silence. "We need to catch her in the act," David said one evening, his voice firm as he looked across the kitchen table at Eleanor. "If we can get her on camera threatening the kids or doing something else illegal, we can make sure she's arrested." Eleanor nodded, though the fear still lingered in her eyes. "But how do we do that? She's smart. She knows how to avoid getting caught." "I don't know yet," David admitted, running his fingers through his hair in frustration. "But we have to try. The police won't act without evidence, and we can't just wait for her to do something worse." It was agreed. They needed a plan. But to catch Rachel in the act, they had to get her to show her true colors, and that would take more than just setting up cameras. They needed to bait her, to create a situation where Rachel would feel cornered and expose herself. The family came together, brainstorming how they could set the trap. They would use the neighborhood's HOA meetings to their advantage, knowing that Rachel often attended and used her position to manipulate others. Eleanor could attend one of the meetings under the guise of asking questions about neighborhood rules, and in doing so, she would create the perfect opportunity to push Rachel into a position where her true nature would be exposed. The children, though scared, agreed to take part in their own way. Lily, in particular, began to show resilience beyond her years, understanding that they couldn't let fear control them. She started helping her mother in small ways, gathering information, and making sure their house was always as safe as possible. Charlie, though still young, began to pick up on the seriousness of the situation, and Eleanor could see the protective streak growing in him. The family was prepared to fight back. They couldn't let Rachel continue to terrorize them. Emotional moments as the tension mounted, Eleanor struggled to cope with the emotional toll it was taking on her. The weight of the fear, the anxiety, and the relentless threats were wearing her down, but she couldn't show it. Not to the kids, not to David. Every time Rachel's face appeared at the door, her heart skipped a beat. Every time she saw her children jump at a loud noise, her soul broke a little more. David, too, was carrying the weight of the situation. As much as he tried to protect his family, there were moments when he questioned whether he was doing enough. Was he really doing everything he could to keep them safe? The guilt was eating at him, making it harder to sleep at night. He could see the fear in Eleanor's eyes, the strain in the children's voices. And the worst part? He couldn't be sure if they were truly safe yet. But they couldn't back down. Not now. They had made it this far, and they were willing to risk everything to expose Rachel for who she really was. The final confrontation was fast approaching. But as they prepared for it, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that Rachel was going to make one last, desperate move to keep control. Every time they thought they had her cornered, she slipped away, her lies and manipulation keeping her one step ahead. But the family was determined. They knew that this time, they would not let her win. They had come this far and they wouldn't back down now. Their plan was set in motion. The trap was laid. Rachel had underestimated them. And soon, she would realize that the tables had turned. The battle for their family's future had only just begun. The evening air was thick with tension as David and Eleanor stood together, silently watching Rachel's house from across the street. The plan they had been meticulously crafting for weeks was finally coming to fruition. The time had come to confront Rachel, to force her into a corner where her lies, manipulation, and threats would no longer hold power over them. They were about to set the trap that would expose her for the dangerous person she truly was. David's hands were clenched tightly at his sides, his pulse quickening with a mixture of anxiety and determination. He turned to Eleanor, who was standing beside him, her face etched with the same fear and resolve. "This is it," he whispered, his voice low and tense. "Are you ready?" Eleanor nodded, her eyes hard with resolve. "We have to do this, David. For the kids. For us. She's gone too far. This ends tonight." They had gathered enough evidence. The footage of Rachel's threats, her subtle intimidation tactics, her manipulation of the neighborhood, everything was in place. The final piece of the puzzle had come together when Rachel, after a series of increasingly erratic interactions, had inadvertently confessed to her manipulation during a conversation with one of the neighbors. That conversation had been recorded, and now it was time to use it. Eleanor had already contacted their lawyer, who was ready to intervene if things went south. But neither of them expected it to come to that. They just had to push Rachel far enough to make her reveal her true nature. The setup the evening had started innocuously enough. Rachel, as always, had been her usual friendly, domineering self. She had shown up at the HOA meeting earlier that day, just as David and Eleanor had planned. Eleanor had attended under the guise of asking a few questions about neighborhood policies, questions that would have appeared innocent to anyone watching, but were designed to provoke Rachel into revealing her manipulative side. It worked. Rachel had immediately taken the bait, her usual persona slipping just slightly when Eleanor had asked about the HOA's financial records. That single question, carefully placed, had set Rachel off. She had started ranting about how people like Eleanor should know their place, how they should be grateful for what the HOA did for the neighborhood, and how she, Rachel, had the power to make or break any of the residents. The cameras were rolling, capturing every word. The confrontation had to happen now, while Rachel was still vulnerable, while she was already on the edge. And so, as the night fell, they waited. The confrontation, it was almost midnight when the knock came. David and Eleanor exchanged one last look before opening the door. There stood Rachel, her smile as cold and calculated as ever. But tonight, there was something different in her eyes, a hint of uncertainty, an edge of fear that Eleanor had never seen before. "Good evening," Rachel said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I thought we could talk. I believe there's been some misunderstanding. I just want to clear the air." David stepped forward, his posture rigid with the tension he was feeling. "Clear the air?" he asked, his voice low. "Rachel, the only thing you need to clear is your conscience. We have everything we need." Rachel's eyes narrowed, but she didn't back down. "I don't know what you mean. I'm just trying to be a good neighbor. Offering help, trying to make sure everything runs smoothly." Eleanor crossed her arms, standing beside David, her face set in a hard expression. You're not here to help, Rachel. You're here to control. You've been manipulating everyone around you for years, playing games with people's lives. Rachel stepped forward, her eyes flickering with anger. You don't know anything about me. I've done what I had to do to survive. People like you, you're the ones who make life harder than it needs to be. David raised an eyebrow. Oh, we know, Rachel. We know about all the people you've hurt, all the lives you've ruined to get what you want. But we've got something that's going to change everything. Rachel's eyes flicked nervously toward the living room. She took a step back, but David blocked her path. We have a recording, Rachel, David continued, his voice steady, almost detached. A recording of everything you've said, everything you've done to manipulate and bully people. We have the proof. The color drained from Rachel's face. Her confident demeanor faltered, replaced by a flash of panic. You think that's going to stop me? She hissed, her voice trembling. You think I'm afraid of you? You should be, Eleanor said, her voice cold and sharp. You're going to be exposed for what you really are, Rachel. This ends now. Rachel's face twisted with rage. You can't do this. You have no idea what you're dealing with. You think you're going to stop me? I can ruin you. I can destroy everything you've worked for. Her words were a final, desperate attempt to regain control. But the family wasn't afraid anymore. They had fought back, and they weren't going to let Rachel intimidate them any longer. The final blow, David stepped forward, his voice unwavering. I've had enough of your games, Rachel. You've tormented my family for too long. Now, it's time for you to face the consequences. With that, he played the recording, Rachel's own voice, caught in the act of manipulating a neighbor, boasting about her control over the HOA, and even threatening Eleanor and her family. The words rang out, each sentence a testament to her cruelty. Rachel's face went pale as the realization sank in. No, she whispered, her voice cracking. You can't do this. You have no idea who I am. Who I know. Eleanor felt a surge of catharsis, a weight lifting from her chest. For so long, they had lived under Rachel's shadow, afraid of what she might do next. But now, in this moment, Rachel's power was stripped away. She was exposed, and there was no turning back. You're done, Rachel, Eleanor said, quietly, her voice strong despite the emotions flooding her. You don't control us anymore. Rachel's eyes flashed with fury, but there was also fear now, real fear. She stepped back, her body trembling as she realized the fight had been taken from her. The power she had wielded for so long was slipping through her fingers, and she knew it. You don't understand, Rachel spat, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll make sure you regret this. You'll all regret it. David stepped aside, allowing Rachel to exit the house. You can leave now, Rachel. You've lost. As Rachel stormed out, slamming the door behind her, Eleanor and David stood together, their hands intertwined. The confrontation had been difficult, but it was over. They had won. Emotional release. The moments that followed the confrontation were filled with a quiet but profound relief. The family stood together in the living room, the weight of the past few weeks finally lifting off their shoulders. But as the adrenaline began to fade, they realized the true cost of the battle they had just fought. Eleanor's knees buckled, and she sank into David's arms, tears streaming down her face. We did it, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. It's finally over. David held her close, his own eyes wet with tears. Yes, it's over. But it's been a long road, Eleanor. A road we couldn't have made it through without each other. The children, who had been hiding in the hallway, came running into the room. Lily threw her arms around her mother, and Charlie hugged his father tightly. The family embraced, surrounded by the warmth and love they had fought so hard to protect. They had endured Rachel's manipulation, her threats, and her cruelty, and now they were free. But as the family held each other, they knew that the emotional scars of this experience would take time to heal. Rachel had done more than just threaten their lives. She had tested their resilience, their unity, and their love for one another. It would take time to recover from the trauma, but they had each other, and that was enough. The justice they had fought for had been served, but it was the emotional journey, the strength they had found in themselves and in each other that would carry them forward. The family knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but with their bond stronger than ever, they were ready for whatever came next. The weeks following the confrontation with Rachel were filled with both relief and quiet reflection. It had taken every ounce of strength the family had, but they had come through the storm stronger than ever. The oppressive weight of fear that had hung over their home like a dark cloud for so long was finally gone. But even as they exhaled in relief, they knew that the healing process would take time, both physically and emotionally. The family's journey toward recovery had only just begun. Healing process Eleanor's body had begun to heal from the physical trauma of her fall, but the emotional scars were harder to overcome. The pain from the attack, the weight of Rachel's threats, and the constant feeling of being trapped had all taken their toll on her. But with time, Eleanor slowly started to find herself again. Each morning, as she woke up to the sunlight streaming through the windows, she felt a little more hopeful, a little more alive. David was by her side through every step of her recovery. He took on the role of caretaker with an unwavering devotion, making sure she had everything she needed. It wasn't just the physical care, though he helped her with everything from taking her medication to ensuring her comfort during the day. It was the emotional support that made all the difference. He had been the protector, the rock that held the family together during the darkest moments. But as they began to rebuild their lives, Eleanor could see the toll it had taken on him as well. The constant fear for their children, the anger at Rachel, and the guilt he had carried, wondering if there was more he could have done, had weighed heavily on his shoulders. But together, they found a way forward. Slowly, David and Eleanor reconnected, rediscovering the love and trust that had always been the foundation of their relationship. Their bond grew deeper, forged by the fire they had walked through together. Their children, too, were beginning to heal. Lily, once terrified and clinging to her mother for comfort, began to show her strength. She had been the first to run to her mother's side when Rachel had attacked, but now she was the first to smile, her eyes lighting up with a newfound sense of security. She found comfort in the routine of school, friends, and the simple joys of being a child again. Charlie, though younger, was just as resilient. His sense of justice, which had been so shaken by the events, began to come back. He showed his strength in quieter ways, by helping Eleanor with small tasks around the house, by checking in on his mother when she seemed down, and by being the protector of his younger sister. The bond between the siblings had been forged in adversity, and it made them both stronger than they ever could have been alone. A heartfelt moment one evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Lily looked up from her plate and, in her soft voice, broke the silence. "Mom, Dad," she began, her eyes serious but full of emotion. "I'm glad we're safe now. I know it was scary, but I'm happy we all stayed together." Charlie nodded in agreement, his little face filled with determination. "Yeah, I'm glad we beat her, Mom. You're not scared anymore, right?" His voice cracked with the vulnerability of a child who had seen too much, but now understood the value of love and safety. Eleanor's heart swelled with emotion as she looked at her children, so full of courage, so full of resilience despite everything they had endured. She reached across the table, taking both of their hands in hers, and smiled through the tears that filled her eyes. "You two are the bravest kids I know. You're the reason I never gave up." David squeezed Eleanor's hand under the table. "We've been through so much, but we're still standing. And nothing can break us now. We've got each other, and that's all we need." The family shared a quiet, tender moment, words unspoken, but understood. They were healing, moving forward, and most importantly, they had each other. The love they shared was the glue that bound them, and they knew that no matter what the world threw at them, they could face it together. A new beginning with the worst of it behind them, Eleanor and David started to look to the future. They knew they had a long road ahead, but they had learned the most valuable lesson of all, how strong they truly were when they stood together. Eleanor had returned to therapy, both for her physical injuries and the emotional scars that Rachel had left behind. Every day was a step toward reclaiming her life. She was learning how to trust again, how to let go of the fear that had once paralyzed her. Though the memories of Rachel's threats would always be with her, Eleanor knew she could move forward because she had the strength to do so. And more importantly, she had a family that would always have her back. David returned to work, but he did so with a new sense of purpose. He was no longer consumed with the constant worry that had kept him awake at night, wondering how to keep his family safe. He was proud of what they had accomplished, and as the days passed, he saw his wife and children growing stronger and more confident. The children returned to school, their innocence no longer clouded by fear. They made new friends, joined new activities, and began to embrace the future with a renewed sense of joy. They had witnessed darkness, but they had also seen the light that came from love, family, and justice. They understood that no matter how bad things might get, they could face anything together. Closing thought as the family sat together that evening, looking out over the peaceful neighborhood. The quiet calm of their home was a stark contrast to the chaos of the weeks before. The house was still standing, the doors were still locked, and the love within these walls was stronger than any fear that had ever threatened to break them. David took Eleanor's hand in his voice quiet but filled with conviction. "We've been through the fire, Eleanor, but we came out stronger. We didn't just survive, we thrived." Eleanor squeezed his hand, her heart full. "You're right. We've learned that nothing, not even Rachel, can take away the love we have for each other. And that's what will keep us going. Together, we're unstoppable." The family sat in silence, the weight of the past finally lifting from their shoulders. They had fought for their safety, their peace, and their dignity. They had faced the darkest parts of humanity, but in the end, it was love that had conquered all. And as they looked ahead to the future, they knew that whatever challenges lay before them, they would face them as a family, united, strong, and unbreakable. Because in the end, love and family would always prevail. If you've enjoyed this emotional roller coaster and want to stay updated with all the twists and turns in the HOA stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a moment of the drama. Don't forget to like and share this video with your friends. Let's get the word out there. What do you think will happen next? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and let's discuss. Join us on this wild ride. And remember, the HOA stories will always keep you on the edge of your seat.